Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us and happy Saturday. My name is Robert. I'll be one of your co-hosts. This is the Crusades live stream history series. Thanks so much for joining us. Before I turn things over to our co-host Richard, let's just go over a few administrative things. So we always welcome people to introduce themselves. So in the Zoom chat, you can let us know your first name, where you're connecting from, and our icebreaker question for today is, who's your favorite historical person? It's always interesting to find out where people are joining us from and to learn more about them. We don't do a Zoom demonstration of these programs. Just very quickly, the audience will be in listen-only mode or muted. We did a sound test earlier. Everything seems to be working fine. If you do need to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. If you want to adjust the screen display, if you're watching us live, so that the slides that we show take up the full screen. If they're not currently taking up the full screen because there's these pictures of these three handsome guys over on the right side, you can make those go away or minimize them at your end by looking for something called either view or view options. And there's a feature called side-by-side mode. Throughout our program, if you have any questions or comments, you can use the chat or the Q&A. Richard will provide some additional instructions on that in just a moment. And these are your three co-hosts. So Richard's the man of the hour. He's going to be the one that's doing most of the talking. Myself, my name is Robert. I'm currently joining you from Austin, Texas. Let's see, what else can I tell you? I'm a big history lover. And let's see, why don't we go from right to left? Zach, why don't you introduce yourselves and tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Zakar, and we basically are the
Zach, I think we lost you.
Zach, are you still there? Oh, we lost him. So that's okay. We'll come back to him. Richard, I'll turn it over to you in just a second. But before I do, I just wanted to mention this is the fourth part in a series we're doing on the Crusades. If you missed parts 1 or 3, or if you have to jump off early for this one, no worries because it's being recorded. I posted the links in the chat in Zoom if you're watching us live. I'll post them on Facebook as well if you're watching there live. And then they were also in the email and the event description that had information for this. I'm happy to send that out. And with that, I will turn things over to Richard. Richard, take it away. It's all yours.
Yeah, if I could introduce the group since Zach isn't available. Our group, we discuss all kinds of history. We do, I tend to specialize in Middle Eastern affairs. There's a whole group that works on the Roman Empire. There's so many different parts of history that we try to cover, and we do these kinds of presentations periodically. I would also ask that if you enjoy what we do, there's a GoFundMe link in the meetup description. Please provide what you think this is worth, so we can continue to maintain all of our expenses. All right, so this is the Crusades, episode 4, the last Crusades in the Mamluks. We'll see how far we get. If we don't finish, that's okay. Right, 2 hour hard stop. An hour 30 minutes hard stop. So we'll just do it next week. So the rules, for those of you who are familiar, please oblige me. I'm not an academic. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. I'm a lay person. And I will try to present, to the extent that these are religious topics, I'm going to try and present it from a secular perspective. And I'm just a lay person who just finds this interesting. I would ask, given the topics, that we be respectful, but at the same time, I love interactivity. I'm interested in questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those questions, comments, and clarifications in the chat. I do read the chat while I'm presenting. I will respond to your questions when the time is right. I say that what I present is a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll probably get you caught up. And if you know something, right, it's a 201, I'll tell you something that you didn't already know. I also have a rule that there's a 90-minute hard stop. I'm looking at the clock right now. It's 2:02, so that puts us at around 1:32 or so. 3:32. And at 3:32 or so, I won't be showing any new slides. We may continue a discussion if we're having a discussion, but you can rest assured that there's no information that you're going to miss, that the next time that we start up, we'll pick up pretty much where we left off. And this is recorded, as Robert said. So this, like the other episodes, will be available on the Washington, D.C. history page, and soon they will come to our History Mostly Ancient YouTube page. All right. So, all right. So last time that we met, we talked about the end of the Fourth Crusade, and the Fourth Crusade ended with the Venetians and the Crusaders arriving in Constantinople, placing Alexios IV onto the throne. And when he was placed on the throne, he basically was unable to pay the 200,000 ducats that he had promised the Crusaders and the Venetians. And so the Crusaders decided that the city itself was worth more to them than the money that they could have taken. And so they sacked the city to gain that wealth. There's a question here of whether there's a connection between Edessa, the city in what's now modern-day Turkey, the city of Şanlıurfa in modern Turkey, and the city of Odessa in Ukraine. Aside from perhaps the names sounding similar, I don't think that they're related. There's certainly no historical correspondence between the two cities. Odessa is a modern city. It was built by the Russians after they conquered that part of Ukraine. All right. And then once the Crusaders had sacked Constantinople, they ended up setting up a government there. And that government was called by them the Roman Empire. Now, of course, that gets confusing, so historians do not call it the Roman Empire. Historians tend to call it the Latin Empire, you can see on this map. And the Latin Empire, though, was not called the Latin Empire by anybody who surrounded it either. And they refused to call it the Roman Empire because they considered the Byzantine Empire to be the Roman Empire. And this was clearly a usurper state. So they called it the Francocratia, or rule by the Franks, right? Kratia is the Greek word for rule, Franco is from Frank. So you ended up having a number of these post-Byzantine states surrounding the Francocratia. And so these are the Despotate of Epirus, the Principality of Achaia, the Duchy of Athens, and the Emperor of Nicaea. And all of these sort of surround, if you went in a counterclockwise, half-moon shape. And those four states combined with Bulgaria, which was not a former Byzantine state, this is a sort of Slavo-Turkic state, were fighting against the Francocratia to control Constantinople. All of these states believed that they were the rightful inheritors of Constantinople. The four post-Byzantine states because that had been their capital, and Bulgaria because they were Orthodox Christian and considered Constantinople the center of Orthodox Christianity. Remember the Hagia Sophia, which is now a mosque, right, was the center of the Orthodox Christian world. That was their Vatican. And so it was located in Constantinople. And because of that, it became that important. Now, the Francocratia was established around 1204. And from 1204 to 1230, we had them slowly losing territory to all of the surrounding states until it was pretty much just a Constantinople city-state for about another 30 years. Now, because of the situation with the Francocratia, you had the Byzantine Empire making peace with the Seljuk Turks, because historically, of course, the Seljuk Turks had been the enemies of the Byzantine Empire. And the two of them had fought numerous wars along their shared border. If you look at the map here, the Byzantine Empire is to the north and to the west, of the Seljuk Empire in this area that I'm circling here. And so as the Seljuks were moving further west and conquering more territory, that put them in direct conflict with the Byzantines who were trying to expand. Remember also we talked about during our second presentation, the wars of John II Komnenos of the Byzantine Empire, who was trying to reconquer most of the territory of Anatolia with varying degrees of success. But that also put him directly against the Seljuk Turks. Now that the Byzantines were the Byzantines represented by the Empire of Nicaea were trying to hold the line in the east and therefore focus on Constantinople, they made peace with the Seljuks, which allowed the Seljuks an unfettered growth and expansion further out. Now, I apologize, this map is in Spanish. I couldn't find the same map in English. And so the capital city here is labeled as Ikonio, is the city of Konya in modern Turkish. And it's also represented as Iconium in its Latin, right? So you have this city of Konya, which was really their center. And you can see that as we move towards the 1200s, you have a massive expansion, first into those Western territories that you see here, then more into the Eastern territories, but most importantly, with the creation of the Francocratia and the peace with the Byzantines, they were able to conquer the northern coastal region here and the southern coastal region here. The northern coastal region with the city of Sinop or Sinope was a very important Black Sea port and allowed the Seljuks to trade with the Crimean Khanate, with some of the other states like the Bulgarians who controlled the city of Burgas, which you can see here. So it allowed for the Seljuks to be more engaged in their local neighborhood. Additionally, on the southern coast, close to Antalya and Alanya, you began to see the Seljuks building coastal towers and beginning to build their own naval fleets. The Seljuks never had a very powerful naval fleet, but they did manage to control a small area of coastline and to begin having trade in the water, which of course is very different than what most Turks are used to. There's a question of whether we can say that Christianity was first recognized in Istanbul, Constantinople, and so it's the first Christian city. And I would say no. The Byzantine Empire, at that time it was Rome, right, ruled by Emperor Constantine, which recognized Christianity as an official state religion. But he recognized it 10 years after the Armenians and Ethiopians separately had recognized Christianity as an official state religion, and a few years after the Georgians had recognized it. So he was not the first national ruler to recognize Christianity as an official state religion, but he was the first city that came into Christianity that was not then separated as an Oriental Orthodox faith. The Georgians did that. So he doesn't even get that credit. So now that they had the coast, they had the, I also have a question, where does the name Byzantium come from? Byzantium was the first name of Constantinople. That was the original name of the city. The city became called Constantinople after Constantine. Constantine declared it New Rome, and the modern name Istanbul is from, it's difficult. There are different arguments as to how it came about, but what I think is the most compelling is that the Slavic pronunciation of Constantinople was Constambul, and the Turks who lived in the city just dropped the cons, so it became Istanbul, which is where you get Istanbul from today. But the city was called Byzantium originally. And there's another question, was whether the Jews were allowed to live in Francocratia. They were not expelled, but they were not well treated either. To the extent that we have records about the Jews in Francocratia, they're very few and far between. Now, those of you who are familiar with Jewish history in that area of the world, people are very familiar with the fact that there was a large Jewish population in Constantinople and a large Jewish population in Thessaloniki, but that would occur 3 centuries later. This would occur during the Ottoman imperial period, where large numbers of Jews immigrated from Spain to those areas. The indigenous Romaniote Jews were not that numerous in these areas. They were more concentrated on the western coast of Greece, like the islands of Corfu and Ioannina. Okay. So once the Seljuks had consolidated all this territory, and they had managed also to incorporate a number of Turkic tribes to the east, if you see those cities of Erzincan and Erzurum, those were under the control of a number of other Turkic tribes, the Mengüceks, the Artukids, the Salkarids, And so you had these groups that were conquered by the Seljuks, allowing them to enlarge their sultanate and allowing them to now have a direct connection with the Persian empires through the city of Ahlat. Now, this connection with Persia manifested in several different ways. The first one was the creation of the caravanserai. And you can see this is a caravanserai from the city of Aksaray. You can see Aksaray on the map. It's very close to Konya. And these caravanserai were massive hotels, perhaps we can say. And the way it would work is that a trader, a merchant, would come to the caravanserai with his horses or his camels. There was one level at the lower part of the caravanserai for the accommodation of these animals, and an upper level for the accommodation of persons who were on that trade. The creation of these caravanserai effectively built a new Silk Road that would go through the Seljuk Sultanate and allowed for the importation of gold, silk, and spices and numerous other goods from the east, bringing an incredible amount of wealth to the Seljuk Sultanate as an intermediary state on the way to Europe. There's a question about whether I'm related to the Asian Sassoon family, the Sassoon family in Asia, and yes, I'm related to them distantly. There's a question about how the Ottoman Empire ruled over Constantinople. That is a very complicated discussion, and if you're interested in my history series, I would say that that's episodes 18 and 19, especially episode 19, The Great Ottoman Conqueror, where I really go into depth as to how Constantinople was taken from the Byzantines by the Ottomans. I spent about an entire hour detailing the military strategy, how the walls were breached, the diplomatic situation where the Ottomans managed to prevent all the European states from intervening. It's a very complicated situation. So I think that it would derail our conversation if we really went into it. So then you have this, you have another connection with Persia which develops, which is Persian bureaucracy. Now, we had mentioned before that when the Seljuks conquered Iran first, they had come from Central Asia through Iran into Turkey, and the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had divided from the great Seljuk Empire in the east. But it was still those same Seljuks, and they still had Persian bureaucrats. But now it became even more pronounced, and the Persian language starts becoming part of the administration of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. We start seeing a number of Turkic individuals taking Persian names as the Persian language becomes the dominant language of writing, the dominant language of law, and the dominant language of communications. One perfect example is actually the Sultan. One of the sultans of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was Kaykhosro. Now, Kaykhosro is a Persian name, and it comes from some of the Persian mythological origins of their country and state. There were, in Persian mythology, there were a number of specific kings who had quasi-divine attributes, and those kings built Persia, and therefore instituted the divine right of kings in Iran. And that divine right of kings actually survived until 1979, right, when the Shah was overthrown. But at this point in time, you have a lot of Seljuk sultans taking these names to solidify their own right of rule. And so you end up having this very weird situation where you have sounds in Persian that don't exist in Turkish, and Turkish having to bend to accommodate them, like that W sound at the end of his name, Kaykhosro. So it ended up being Kaykhosrev in Turkish. All right. Now, we mentioned that Konya was their capital city, and during this period, Konya becomes known as a holy city. It becomes the center of a number of different Islamic doctrines, especially the Sufistic doctrines. And you can see here, on the left-hand side, you can see Alauddin Kaikubad Mosque, which is one of the first major mosques that was built by the Seljuks. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that the base of the mosque is actually square. When we think of mosques from Turkey today, we think of sort of the shape of Hagia Sophia, right? The round domes and sort of that central portico. That was an Ottoman style creation building on Byzantine styles of architecture. The Seljuks didn't build this way. The Seljuks tended to build in this more rectilinear pattern. And even the circular, I don't know what you want to say, tower that you can see in the back of the mosque, that comes from centuries later during the Ottoman period. So the actual mosque itself has this rectilinear form. There's a comment that Persian was used by the noble ruler while ordinary people kept speaking Turkish. That's absolutely true. But the Turkish that was used by the common people became increasingly influenced by Persian. And you can still see that in versions of Turkish that have not been affected by the government of the Republic of Turkey, like the Turkish that's spoken in Azerbaijan or the Turkish that's spoken in northwestern portions of Iran today. There's a significant percentage of Persian loanwords in those varieties of Turkish. And to a certain extent, they exist in modern Turkish, but not as much. Now, getting back to Konya, one of the things that you can notice is that I took some tiles from Kubadabad Palace, which is also in Konya, just outside of the city. And if you look very closely, you can see depictions of human beings. Now, one of the things that's traditionally taught about Islam is that Islam forbids the depiction of human beings, certainly, especially in Sunni Islamic schools. This was not the case in the Sufistic kind of Islam practiced by the Seljuk Sultanate. They had integrated, they had syncretized a number of their Tengrist beliefs, right? Because the Seljuks were from Central Asia, where they worshiped Tengri, the great sky. And they'd integrated some of these Tengrist beliefs with the Sufistic beliefs and the Hanafi school that was beginning to dominate, which allowed them a greater fluidity and freedom in terms of their artistic talent than you typically see in more strict Islamic states. We also see during this period Ibn Arabi, which some people are familiar with, especially because of his presence. That picture is from the Turkish series Muhteşem Yüzyıl, Magnificent Century. No, sorry, this is from Ertuğrul, the Turkish series Ertuğrul, which covers a little bit after this period in Turkish history. And Ibn Arabi was very old at that time. At this time, he's rather young. And he was a Sufi mystic. He tried to connect Platonic ideas to Islam with some degree of success. Neoplatonism as a philosophy ultimately fails in the Islamic context, where it survives in the Jewish and Christian contexts. But he created sort of a way of holding together this Sufistic belief with certain Tengrist elements that could be syncretized and creating something that at least nominal scholars would approve of. We also see large-scale banking beginning in Konya because of the Caravanserai bringing in wealth to the city. And accordingly, you had a systematized system of coinage within the state. All right. Now, if we go back to the Middle East, remembering what we did last time, you had the Treaty of Jaffa signed between Richard and Saladin in 1192, 1 year before Saladin dies, and right before Richard has to go back to France in order to conclude his issues, right? Because of course he was the ruler of Angevin France, English-controlled France, and this Treaty of Jaffa really reestablished the Crusader state of the Kingdom of Jerusalem existing along the Levantine coast, between the cities of Tyre and the cities of Jaffa. This means that the Crusader states wouldn't be removed by Saladin, and it would fall to his successors to finish the job. So we end up having a very complex set of familial situations that occur between 1193 and 1200. And these familial situations come to a head because Saladin chooses one of his sons, Abdal Ali, to be his successor. Now, the majority of the other members of the Ayyubid family refuse to recognize Abdal Ali as the right successor to Saladin. He's considered too young, too pliable, And the opposition is headed by Afdal Ali's brother, Al-Aziz Othman. However, the real star of the show is Saladin's brother, Saif ad-Din. Saif ad-Din was called by the Europeans as Safadin. And Safadin, while Saladin was alive, was Saladin's war minister. He was responsible for maintaining all the logistics that allowed Saladin to continually run these campaigns in the Levant region, despite having his power base in Egypt and his food base in Egypt. He was the one who was responsible for coordinating troop movements. He understood how, from a functional mechanism, to actually run the state that Saladin was spending a significant amount of time trying to militarily expand. And Safadin put his weight behind Afdal Ali in this struggle between the brothers. Now, eventually, it becomes clear that Afdal Ali cannot defeat Al-Aziz Othman and his allies, and so Safadin changes sides, supports Al-Aziz Othman against Afdal Ali, and Afdal Ali is pushed aside, and Al-Aziz Othman becomes the next Ayyubid Sultan. And he remains Sultan for a year or so before he dies. And so we then have another fight for power, where Safadin ends up supporting his own son, Al-Kamil, against Afdal Ali, who had been pushed to the side before, but now came back with a vengeance. And Afdal Ali united with the governor of Damascus, Al-Zakhir Ghazi. There were a number of fights that Safadin and Al-Kamil led against Al-Zakhir Ghazi, especially taking the city of Damascus in 1199, and then quickly, as soon as Damascus was taken, defeating Afdal Ali's forces in Egypt. He then installed his son Al-Kamil as vice regent in Egypt and took rule for himself in 1200, which ends this interregnum of 7 years while the different Saladin successors fought amongst themselves. While knowing these names and these particular events can be rather confusing, the real point to take away from this is that Saladin had been campaigning his entire life to unify the Zengid territories and to remove the Crusader states. He nearly was able to remove the Crusader states. The only two cities that were left were Tripoli and Tyre, and Antioch in the north. But he had effectively unified Egypt with the Levant region for the most part. But as soon as he died, all of that unity, all of that hard work that he had put into creating a functional Ayyubid Sultanate had really collapsed with his children and his nephews not respecting the system that he had set up and not respecting his choice of successor. There's a question about whether this succession story sounds similar to that of Muhammad. It doesn't read that way to me. Muhammad doesn't really have much in the way of family. He had the only real family successor he has is Ali, but it's sort of a squabble between Ali as his son-in-law and the Shura, or the convened council, which chooses in succession different apostles of Muhammad. Abu Bakr was his father-in-law, but the other two, Omar and Uthman, had no relationship to Muhammad. And so you had a functional disagreement about who should inherit the power. And so in that way, there is something similar, but this interregnum in the Ayyubid case was a lot more destabilizing than the interregnum in the Sunni Shiite case prior to the Fitna al-Kubra in 661. So there was about 30 years after Muhammad died that were relatively unified in terms of the Muslim community. This happened as soon as Saladin died. You had this fight for succession. Now, as soon as Safadin takes direct control in 1200 and rules until he dies in 1218, Egypt comes into an incredible period of prosperity. And this is primarily because Safadin really understood how to run a country. We don't know an incredible number of details in terms of the rule that he had, but we do know that taxes were generally lower. There was a significant amount of money in the financial coffers. And we know this because in 1205, there was a large-scale earthquake, and in 1207, No, in the early 1200s, there was a large earthquake and a large flood, both of which occurred within a few years, and yet neither bankrupted the Egyptian coffers. The Egyptian government was able to provide restitution to the local population and help them weather those disasters. At the same time, Safaddin made a number of pleas to Europe to stay out of Egypt. He engaged in truces with the Crusader states to prevent them from invading, and because of that, there were only two attempted raids by Crusaders, or by Europeans actually, on his seaside, specifically the ports of Damietta and Rosetta, the same Rosetta from the Rosetta Stone. Damietta and Rosetta in 1205 and 1207, but otherwise he maintained a relatively peaceful relationship with the Crusader states. They engaged in trade under his rule, and he spent the majority of his time trying to just grow the local economy and recover from the wars that Saladin had been waging. Now, during the time that Safaddin was ruling, the situation in Europe changed substantially. Pope Innocent III became Pope, and he was an adamant supporter of crusading and an adamant enemy of the Muslims. In fact, he demanded that there be a boycott of Muslims throughout the Catholic world. For a variety of reasons, this did not hold, especially Venice engaged in large-scale trade with Safaddin. So the boycott was something that the Venetians conveniently ignored. But Pope Innocent III declared numerous different crusades. He was responsible for declaring a crusade against the Albigensians, the crusade in Spain against the Almohads, and the crusades as well in the north. He issued a number of bulls related to that. But what's important for us is that he also issued crusades against the regimes in the Middle East. And the way he managed to incentivize this was through the promulgation of indulgences. And an indulgence is a certification that your sins would be forgiven. Remember, in Catholicism, that the priest is the intermediary or intercessor between God and any person. And so the Pope, as the most senior priest, interceded with God and got favor for those who would fight in the Crusades. That is what the indulgence was, that intercession. So if you fought in the Crusades, your sins on earth would be forgiven, no matter what they were. Now, one of the things is that, right, he also now had this weird situation of there being two possible crusade paths. Since the Venetians had taken Constantinople, right, we remember that the Franco-Cratia was being besieged by the Byzantine states and the Bulgars, which meant that Constantinople had to be reinforced, and at the same time, Jerusalem had to, not the Crusader state of Jerusalem, which didn't control the city of Jerusalem, needed to be reinforced. So the question was, which way should it go? And so in 1213, he issues the Quia Maior, which calls for another crusade in the east, this time directed at Jerusalem, but not directly at Jerusalem. Even though we mentioned with Richard during the Third Crusade that going for Egypt was something that had not quite become palatable, by the time of Quia Maior, Egypt being the primary point of entry for the Crusaders seems to have gotten off the ground. That is what most people thought would make sense, because Egypt was economically viable. You would invade Egypt, and then from Egypt, make your way to the Crusader states. There's a point here that says that Omar was actually technically related to Muhammad because Muhammad married his daughter. I forgot about all of Muhammad's marriages. There's a question of whether there was a different cost for each sin. In theory, there would have been, but The indulgences could be purchased. That's a different issue within the church that starts developing in the 13 and 1400s, which leads to the Reformation. But these indulgences were simply for the act of crusading, you got this indulgence. So it wasn't categorized by sin. There's a question as to why there's a picture of Pope Pius XII. I was using a picture of an indulgence. And so it's a paper document. Now, some of those indulgences exist from the later period. I couldn't find an indulgence from that period. All right. So in the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, following the Quia Maior in 1213, the decision to attack Egypt was formalized, and the call for a crusade to Egypt that would be led was made, and the king who agreed to lead it was Frederick II Hohenstaufen of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, sorry, 1 second. So now the issue with Frederick II Hohenstaufen is that I want to thank somebody in the comments. This is what's called a plenary indulgence. And so therefore it covers every sin as opposed to partial indulgences, which do not. All right. So you've got Frederick II Hohenstaufen making that agreement with Pope Innocent III that he would lead the Crusades in Egypt. The problem for him was that he was far more concerned about his territories in the Holy Roman Empire. So he never actually showed up for this crusade. He sent soldiers on his behest, but he had given them orders that they shouldn't accept any treaty or negotiation until he could be there to ratify it, which of course meant that a significant portion of the Crusaders would be unable to make any sort of decisions on the ground because his approval wasn't viable. Now, there were two leaders that did try to make their way. The second was Andrew II, King of Hungary. And Andrew II, King of Hungary, decided to get on the boat. Then once he was on the boat, decided he didn't like the boat and went back to Hungary. So he got further than Frederick, but not significantly. In terms of the people from Central Europe, of the secular side, who were involved in the Crusades, Leopold VI, Duke of Austria, got the furthest, but as a duke, his voice didn't carry as much weight, and so he couldn't negotiate effectively on behalf of the European Crusaders. There were also two other individuals who are significantly more important. The first one is Pelagius Galvani, who was the papal legate, meaning that he represented the interests of the Catholic Church with regards to the crusade. And this was different because, right, if we remember the second and the first crusade was primarily led by nobles, right? Not by any kings, not by any religious ecclesiastical leaders. At the same time, during the second and third crusades, those were led primarily by European kings. Like the second crusade was led by Conrad of the Holy Roman Empire, and the third crusade was led by Richard I of England. So this was a departure in that for the first time, we had a representative of the Pope directly supervising the crusade. And the last individual was John of Brienne. John of Brienne was the king of Jerusalem at the time. And so he brought forces from Jerusalem to meet with the Europeans on the Egyptian coast and take the cities that would be part of that crusade. There's a question of whether the various Austro-Hungarian royalty were related at this time. At this time, no. At this time, the Hungarian monarchy and the Habsburg dynasty of Austria were two separate dynasties. The Habsburgs would come to take over the Hungarian lands as a result of the Ottoman invasions that destroyed the Hungarian monarchy under Lajos II. Okay. Now, while the Europeans had a fractious leadership, so did the Ayyubids. So as we get to when the crusade actually takes off, the Lateran Council happens in 1215 while Saladin is still alive. But the European kings have a tradition of waiting out the clock. It takes a long time for them to acquire the resources necessary for crusading. It takes a long time for them to settle the local conflicts that they don't want to be defenseless for before they send their soldiers. And so these things tend to drag on. And so by the time that we start having movement across the Mediterranean, we're already past Saladin's death in 1218. And so Saladin's children, Al-Kamil in Egypt and Al-Mu'azzam Isa in Damascus, end up being the two Ayyubid princes who end up taking territory after Saladin lost power, after Saladin died. And so the two of them were at odds in many cases over governance. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't come together. You had a Mamluk rebellion. Now, the Mamluk, right, were these slave soldiers. You can see a picture of one on the upper right-hand side. And the Mamluk had been part of the Ayyubid army. They were not the central part of the army. The central part of the army was still the Nubian and Arab infantry divisions. But these Mamluk had an incredible amount of power, despite the fact that they were slaves, because they were the upper echelons, the most skilled of the military elite. And they decided that they wanted to take power. Now, they knew that legitimacy would be an issue, because as slaves, they couldn't expect the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to support their kind of rebellion. So the way that they chose to rebel was to support a third brother, Al-Faiz Ibrahim. And they were going to launch a coup against Al-Kamil and install Faiz Ibrahim as the new Ayyubid ruler. At this moment, Al-Mu'azzam Isa gets word of the plot, spreads it to Al-Kamil, and the two of them fight together to stop this Mamluk uprising. So there is some love between the brothers, but other than that, there were a number of conflicts between Al-Kamil and Al-Mu'azzam Isa over the extent of each of their territories, and over the extent to which Al-Mu'azzam Isa was able to be autonomous, because Al-Kamil was the legal inheritor of Safavidin's entire empire. Now, this meant that when the Crusaders arrived, Al-Kamil was much more concerned about dealing with Al-Mu'azzam Isa in the foreseeable future than he was with anything that the Crusader states could throw at them. And so he offered the Crusaders that if they would leave Egypt, he would do everything in his power to guarantee that they would have access to a number of Crusader fortresses that had previously been taken by Saladin and were now part of Al-Mu'azzam Isa's territory. He promised them that he would return to them the true cross, and he promised that he would pay them an indemnity, which all of this sounded like a really great offer, especially to John of Brienne, because John of Brienne was leading the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This would have increased his territory by about 2 times, made it significantly more defensible, and even Jerusalem would have been included in that extent of territory, so he would have gotten Jerusalem back. That said, the German contingents who would theoretically have been under Hohenstaufen refused to accept the terms because they've been told that not to accept anything until Frederick Hohenstaufen was in Egypt. And Pelagius, the papal legate, believed that it wasn't a crusade unless Muslims were being killed. So he also demanded that this be rejected. And so the nays carried. And this led to a massive siege on the port city of Damietta, which takes the better part of 2 years, including brutal winters. And the reason that this was very difficult to take is that the Egyptians were well stocked, the position was very defensible, and the Crusaders did not understand how to breach the Nile at this point. To make matters worse, when they finally did take the city of Damietta, and Al-Kamil reiterated his terms, Pelagius, who had no military skill, was put in charge of managing the military advance of the Crusaders from Damietta. Now, the reason that Pelagius was able to take power was that the Duke of Austria, was Leopold VI, was not taken seriously, and John of Brienne actually had dynastic issues of his own. He was married to the princess of Armenian Cilicia. So in 1220, John of Brienne goes to Armenian Cilicia in an attempt to gain the crown of Cilician Armenia, to which he was at least theoretically entitled. Between March of 1220 and by the time he returns in July of 1221, it's determined that as a Latin, right, a believer in Roman Catholicism, he is not eligible to be the leader of Armenian Cilicia, because the Armenians are part of the Armenian Apostolic Church, and since he's not a member of that church, he can't inherit the kingdom. But that means that it's nearly 15 months later, and during that period, Pelagius basically had this free hand in order to invade Egypt. Now, an important piece of Egyptian geography to understand here is that the Nile Delta is an area that is heavily regulated by a number of what are called sluice gates. So you have the tributaries of the Nile, they spread out, and you want to keep the Nile back from a certain area so it doesn't flood over, and then you slowly release the water so it can go through the irrigation channels. So in the springtime, a lot of this water gets saved up and then slowly distributed through, especially through the summer when the water is more prone to evaporate otherwise. So you had all of this water behind the sluice gates. As the Crusaders marched out through the Delta to get to Cairo, Al-Kamil opened the sluice gates and allowed all this water to just drown out the Crusader forces. Now, some of the military commanders may have foreseen this, it's doubtful, but certainly Pelagius did not. And this doomed the Fifth Crusade to the point where they came to terms with Al-Kamil. He let them leave the country. They did not get an indemnity. They did not get more fortresses. Their territory did not expand in any meaningful way since the beginning of the crusade, and it was deemed a failure considering how many people died, how no territory was gained, and it seemed like the geopolitical situation had not changed at all as a result of the Fifth Crusade. So it's worth taking a second to talk a little bit about Frederick II Hohenstaufen, because he is a rather eccentric person. While he was alive, he was called Stupor Mundi, or the wonder of the world, because he was very much interested in a variety of scientific and literate and historical pursuits. Now, he grew up in Sicily, and so because of Sicily's connection to the Arab world, he spoke fluent Arabic. And in fact, he had good relations with Al-Kamil. Throughout his life, he and Al-Kamil exchanged several gifts. Probably the most famous exchange was when he sent a polar bear to Egypt, and Al-Kamil sent a giraffe up to Germany. I'm sure both of these animals were very happy with their new living conditions, but their friendship really, it's part of what led to their friendship existing long term. We have numerous letters between the two of these rulers. And so, despite the fact that he was a believing Catholic and he was rather pious, he killed a number of heretics in his own territory, his religion was often considered suspect due to his interest in science, due to his interest in Arabo-Islamic culture. And it may well be said that he considered himself closer to people like Al-Kamil, who were educated like he was, than he was to the peasant pious Christian who doesn't have that kind of exposure or experience. Now, you can also see that the relationship between Frederick II and Innocent III became increasingly strained as we moved through the 1220s. And the reason for that is twofold. The first one is that Frederick II had promised to go on the Fifth Crusade and didn't go. And he kept saying that he would do it, he would do it. By 1225, the Pope was starting to lose his patience. And he said, if you don't go on crusade in the next 2 years, you're going to be excommunicated. So in 1227, Frederick II is preparing to go on crusade, and then he gets sick. So he stays a few months over in Venice, and then it's 1228. and he wants to go on the crusade. The Pope says, no, you said 2 years, and I've made you promise 2 years. And so he excommunicated Frederick II for failure to live up to his crusading vows. Now, the second reason comes in here. If you look at the territory under the Holy Roman Empire, while Frederick II Hohenstaufen was in power, it included both the Kingdom of Sicily and almost all the territories of northern Italy, meaning that the Papal Kingdom was sandwiched between Holy Roman imperial territory. And the Pope, from a geopolitical perspective, didn't like the idea of being completely surrounded by the Holy Roman Empire. And so when Frederick II protested against this excommunication, the Pope said it would be very simple to reverse the excommunication. Just give the Papal States control of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, the control of the southern half of the Italian peninsula and Sicily. And Frederick II responded that this was pure and clear extortion, that the Pope was only excommunicating him so that way he had leverage in order to get the Kingdom of Sicily. And to add insult to injury, the Holy Roman Empire was a role that was elected. It wasn't a hereditary title necessarily. The different leaders of the different states voted in proportion to their power. And the papacy was part of the crowning ceremony of the Holy Roman Empire, which meant that the papacy had some control over which people would become Holy Roman emperors, and therefore was part of this political process that led Frederick II Hohenstaufen to see this excommunication demand to give to the papacy the Kingdom of Two Sicilies as that form of extortion, as a way of increasing papal power in the Holy Roman Empire, and he wasn't having it. So in 1228, he decided to set out for a crusade with or without papal support, and he was going to go to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, by a strange quirk of fate, Frederick II Hohenstaufen had married John of Brienne's daughter, which meant that after John of Brienne died, Frederick II was now the legal inheritor of the Crusader states. So it was even within his own territory to go to the Crusader states, and that's exactly what he does. And so he arrives there in 1228, and now, if he had gotten there a few years earlier, Al-Mu'azzam Isa would still have been in power, but Al-Mu'azzam Isa had died in 1227. So any leverage that he may have had in swaying Al-Kamil by saying, you'll have the Crusader states as a bulwark against Mu'azzam Isa, basically that had evaporated. Still, Al-Kamil was willing to make terms with Frederick II Hohenstaufen, and the two of them met, and he offered them pretty much the same terms as he had offered the Fifth Crusade, which is that he would restore Jerusalem in exchange for peace. Now, he did not offer more Crusader castles, and he did not offer the return of the True Cross, but he offered Jerusalem, which was really the point of the crusade. And so the two of these leaders gave pronouncements saying that they didn't want to go to war, that they respected, Christian and Muslim life too dearly to want to extend on such a bloodbath. And through this act of peaceful negotiation, Jerusalem was back under Crusader hands. And the intuition that one would have is that this would be a moment of glorious celebration, that the Christians would be happy. They now had control of the Holy City, the one that they had been fighting for so long, and had lost in 1187. So it had been out of Crusader control for nearly 50 years. For nearly 40 years. And that was not the reaction at all. The majority of the Crusader state leadership was vehemently opposed to this agreement that they had just made with Al-Kamil. And there were several reasons for this. The first was, since Frederick II was excommunicated at the time that he made this deal, it was not a legitimate Christian conquest. And even the patriarch, Gerald of Lausanne, this is the picture of the current Latin patriarch of Jerusalem, but Gerald of Lausanne was the patriarch at the time. And the Latin Patriarch is the representative of Roman Catholics in Jerusalem through the papacy, right? This is the equivalent of a papal legate, like Pelagius Galvani. So the Patriarch Gerald of Lausanne put Jerusalem under what is called interdiction, which means that no Roman Catholic services can be performed in Jerusalem, as it is a territory controlled by a heretic. Additionally, many of the noble families in the Kingdom of Jerusalem also resisted this new territory, because they pointed out that the Crusader castles were not were not under Crusader control, and therefore Jerusalem was a very difficult city to defend. This has actually been a problem that's persisted in modern times. The state of Israel has fought many wars between 1947 and 1967 over the control of the highway between Jerusalem and the coast, because of Jerusalem's very indefensible location without surrounding territory. So the military analysts of this time during the Crusader period had the same reaction. Jerusalem would be hard to control, even though it was part of the Crusader states. And so, and the third issue that both parties brought to bear is that Frederick II Hohenstaufen had just waltzed in as a foreigner and not really given ear to what the locals in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem wanted or needed or were interested in. He didn't consult with them before making this deal, and very much he ignored the traditions of the Crusader state of Jerusalem, which had effectively been an independent state with its own set of codes between the various noble families that ruled there. This in particular came to a head when Frederick II Hohenstaufen decided to take the lands of John of Ebelin. John of Ebelin was the son of, John of Ebelin was the man who had given Saladin Jerusalem. After Saladin had been given Jerusalem, he moved north to Beirut and he took lands there. The guy played by Orlando Bloom. If you watch Kingdom of Heaven, this is him, as a senior citizen. So, according to the laws of the Crusader state of Jerusalem, no noble could lose his land unless all the nobles came together in consensus and agreed that it should be deprived of him. Of course, Frederick II had not done this, and John of Ebelin said that this was a violation of the local laws and customs, which it was. And Frederick II's response was, "I'm the king. Why are we having this discussion?" Which led to a large-scale revolt against him and his rule from 1228 to 1243. And you had John of Ebelin rallying behind him most of the lords of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Templar Knights and the Genoese, who were shipping in fresh food and promoting trade with the Crusader states against Frederick II's authority. Frederick II decided to leave personally, but he sent a number of forces from the European mainland in order to pacify the region, led by Riccardo Filangieri, an Italian marshal. And Filangieri had a number of forces behind him, particularly Pisans, right, from the city of Pisa in Italy, as well as the supporters from Bohemond V of Antioch and of Tripoli. Those two kingdoms had become united more or less, as well as the Teutonic and Hospitaliers. And this war, called the War of the Lombards, raged for over 15 years, with Riccardo Filangieri finally being caught in the city of Tyre and being besieged by the lords of Jerusalem there. And unlike Saladin, the siege of Tyre was broken. But the reason the siege of Tyre was broken is because the people in Tyre didn't even like the Germans that Riccardo Filangieri was representing. So they opened the gate and let the lords in to remove these forces, which vacated and went back to Germany or Italy, depending on where they had come from in the Holy Roman Empire. This was a key victory, and Alice of Champagne, who was the only legitimate descendant of the King of Jerusalem who could inherit the throne, was given power. And so the Queen of Jerusalem basically redeclared the independence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from any European interference. Now, while this had been going on, while we had had this War of the Lombards, this civil war, effectively, within the Crusader states, we have the Mongols moving into this territory. Now, one of the things that's worth pointing out about the Mongols is that their arrival in the Middle East changed the geopolitics quite significantly. And they had overthrown the Khwarezmian Empire, an empire that controlled much of what is now Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and these areas. And by overthrowing the Khwarezmian Empire, the Khwarezmians, who were a Turkic group, were forced to flee further west. And they were chased in 1230 by a Mongol leader named Chormakan. And so Chormakan enters Anatolia with these Mongols, and it is something that none of the people in the Levant had ever seen before. It was incredibly scary and strange, and the size of his forces led various reactions from throughout the peoples of the Levant and Anatolia. One of the most interesting reactions was that of the Christian peoples in the region, particularly the Georgians and the Cilician Armenians. The Georgians and Cilician Armenians had slightly different reactions, but in the end it comes to the same. King Hetum I of Armenia went out to the Mongols and actually pledged the loyalty of the Cilician Armenian state to the Mongol cause in exchange for being protected from the various states that surrounded them. And the Mongols agreed. Armenian knights, the Cilician knights, were integrated into the Mongol cavalry and became part of the forces that not only fought against Jalaluddin Migbonno, the last king of the Khwarezmians, but against the Seljuk Turks as well. The Georgians resisted at first, then half of Georgia was burnt down, and then they stopped resisting and they became allies of the Mongols. And so both of these states effectively became Mongol vassals in the territory. And Hetum I of Armenia tried to convince the Crusader states to also align with the Mongols. He was successful in convincing Antioch and Tripoli to become vassal states of the Mongols in the 1240s. The Kingdom of Jerusalem remained ambivalent about whether they should become a Mongol vassal state or they should try to resist. And you can see on the right-hand side, this is actually a picture of King Hetum in Karakoram, the Mongol capital, in 1254. He went there to have an audience with Mengke, the great Khan, at that time, and promote the relationship between Cilician Armenia and the Mongol great Khanate. After Chormakan died, he was replaced by Baiju Noyan, who was another Mongol emissary, and they fought the Battle of Kösedag, which is a huge battle in Turkish history, almost as important as Manzikert. And it happened in the eastern part of Turkey. Now, Kösedag means hairy mountain, and it was called that because in this eastern part of Turkey, you have an incredible amount of thick trees. You can see sort of what that would look like. This is actually about 5 kilometers from where the battle took place, that picture. And you can see very dense woods. It's not the kind of terrain that would normally favor the Mongols. But that said, the Mongols had a number of allies, especially Armenian Cilicia and the Georgians. Khosrow II, the Seljuk Sultan, rallied to his banner everybody he could bring. He had Byzantines supporting him. He had soldiers from the Francocratia that he paid as mercenaries. He had a number of different leaders from different coalitions fighting on his side, but still the Mongols defeated the Turks decisively at this battle. And from this point on, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome exists only as a vassal state of the Mongols until it is effectively destroyed in 1307. Now, one of the interesting things is that we actually see, this is the only moment in history that I'm aware of where Crusaders and Mongols actually fought each other. And the interesting thing is that one of the things that we had noticed was that in the Battle of Dorylaeum and the Siege of Nicaea, all the way back at the beginning of the First Crusade, when you have light cavalry shooting these arrows from composite bows, it can't actually pierce the armor worn by Crusaders. And that's exactly what happens here. The Crusaders are basically unkillable until the Mongols directly approach them with melee weapons. That said, 300 Crusader knights is not enough to hold back tens of thousands of Mongol horsemen. And so that leads to the Seljuk defeat here. Now, the Mongol expansion, as we pointed out, destroys Khwarezm. You can see on the map in purple. And the Khwarezmians, as I mentioned, fled further west and became a nomadic Turkic people. That as nomadic Turkic people, they were accepted by the Ayyubids to be a mercenarial force on their behalf. The other group that the Mongols expanded against was to their northwest, which is the Kipchaks. And the Kipchaks are Kazakh people are Kipchak people, but there are many different Kipchaks that are not Kazakh today. So the state of the Kipchaks, it's Turkic people like you would find in Kazakhstan today. And these Kipchaks were forced further west because of the Mongol conquest. And large numbers of Kipchaks were enslaved and sold in the slave markets in Istanbul during the Franco-Karakia period. And then from Constantinople, from Constantinople, they were sold onwards to Egypt. And they become a very important part of our story. Because in 1240, Al-Kamil dies in 1238. There's a succession crisis, and As-Salih Ayyub comes to power 2 years later in 1240. He accepts the Khwarezmians as this sort of mercenarial force, but he starts his rule in Damascus, where there's an uprising against him, and he flees to the citadel in Cairo. And because there's this uprising against him, he doesn't know which Kurdish nobles, because the uprising had come from the Kurdish nobility, which of these Kurdish nobles was responsible or would be responsible for any future revolts against him. And so he decides that he needs an army that is strictly loyal to him. And so with all of these Kipchaks now on the slave market, he decides that he is going to buy a large number of these Kipchaks, nearly 1,000 of them, to be his own personal bodyguards and retinue, which becomes a new corps of Mamluk, right? A new corps of Turkic slave soldiers. Now, I have a question about melee weapons. Melee weapons are swords, spears, maces, javelins, to the extent that they're held in your hand. It's as opposed to ranged weapons like catapults, bows and arrows, that sort of thing. All right. So when he creates this large Mamluk army, they become known as the Bahriya Mamluks, or the riverside or seaside Mamluks, because they defend the part of Cairo that faces towards the river. And with this force of Kipchak Mamluks, combined with these mercenarial Khwarezmians, As-Salih Ayyub begins to fight back against the Crusader state of Jerusalem. In 1244, he attacks the city of Jerusalem indirectly. He sends the Khwarezmians to do it. He doesn't lead his own forces, so at least he can pretend that it was a third party as opposed to his own action. The Khwarezmians are incredibly brutal when they take Jerusalem back, very similar to what we remember from the Christian side when they took Jerusalem in the First Crusade. The Khwarezmians slaughtered a large number of Christian monks, as well as other, I don't know if they targeted Jews, but they targeted other Christians as well in the city, and brought it back under Ayyubid rule. Jerusalem would not be under the control of a Christian majority government until the 20th century with the British, from this point forward. Now, the city of Jerusalem once the Khwarezmians had sort of purged it of the Christians, became part and parcel of the Ayyubid state like any other. And this led to a great confrontation where the Khwarezmians and the Mamluk led the Ayyubid army against the Crusader states at the Battle of La Fourbi. La Fourbi was a gross miscalculation by the Crusader state of Jerusalem, in which over half of the knights in the entire territory were killed. And forever from that point forward, the Crusader states would not be able to mount an effective offense against the Ayyubid Sultanate. There's a question, did they massacre the Christians? What do you mean by purge? Yes, the Khwarezmians massacred a significant number of Christians and expelled a number of them from the city. We have to remember that different events in the Crusades resulted in different situations. So a lot of Muslims today, for example, focus on Saladin. When Saladin took Jerusalem in 1187, he gave the Christians permission to freely leave the city, to ransom themselves, and allowed Christians to eventually return to the city on pilgrimage. The Khwarezmians were not Saladin. The Khwarezmians were brutal through the way that they had ruled Iran, but brutalized additionally by what they had seen fighting the Mongols. When the Mongols had taken the lands of Khwarezm, what's now eastern Iran and western Afghanistan, they had burned entire cities alive. We have estimates of the casualties in the millions. Entire cities turned into skull mountains, like the way that the Mongols had invaded. And of course, you can hear more about it in my episode 14 in my Middle Eastern history series, where I go through the conquest of Khwarezm. That destruction caused them to be so uninterested in the concerns of human life and human dignity. And the Ayyubids themselves were shocked by what the Khwarezmians did in Jerusalem. But they let them do it so they would have plausible deniability and then be able to rule over a city that was mostly empty, and then they could fill with Syrians and other people from the other Muslims from the surrounding area. All right. So once we have Salah Ayyub defeating the Crusaders at La Fourbi, we have Louis IX of France deciding that he wants to lead a crusade as well. Louis IX concentrates his power and saves for over 10 years to have the wealth to launch a crusade. He plans meticulously, gets his boats together, and in 1248, he sets sail for in 1248 he sets sail for Egypt. And this looks like a repeat of the Fifth Crusade, right? They arrive at Damietta, they besiege the city, but this time the Egyptians are relatively underfunded. The fortress falls in a little under a week, and it is seen as a great sign that the French-led crusade, led by a very pious Louis IX, everybody knew that he was a true believing Catholic. He was very straightforward about his faith. He even would quiz some of his attendants about Catholic principles in order to make sure that they were aware of the religious edicts. And his taking of Damietta within one day seemed to have been a godsend. Now, after Damietta fell, Louis IX decides to move towards Mansoura. And if you look at the map, you can see the movement from Damietta to Mansoura down through the Nile Valley. And he got to the city, but the city was garrisoned by these Bahriya Mamluk, these Mamluks of Salih Ayyub. And in that city, they were able to maintain effective defenses. Now the city and the garrison was on the far side of the Nile, and the Nile at this point was too wide to be easily crossed. And this led to different attempts of how to cross the Nile. The first thing that the French decided to do was to fill in the river. So they started digging sand and throwing the sand in the river. The Muslims on the other side were rather unimpressed by this, and so they just started digging out the river on their side. So the river, King Louis IX couldn't actually cross the river this way. He relied on Robert I. I believe it was his brother, who was Count of Artois. And Robert I found an Egyptian who was willing to betray Egypt and show a way to ford this tributary of the Nile, which they did. But Robert I didn't wait for Louis IX to bring forth the majority of the French forces behind him. He went directly after the castle, believing that his surprise would lead to a defeat of the castle in Mansoura. He was correct that the Egyptians were surprised. He was not correct that he would be victorious. One of these Bahriya Mamluk named Baybars, we're going to see more of him later, was in charge of the defense of the city of Mansoura. And what he chose to do was he let all the Franks in, then he closed the door behind them, and then used the impossible labyrinthine pathways of the city to isolate the Franks and then kill them. He allowed 5 Franks to survive, to then go to Louis IX and tell the story. Robert I, of course, was not one of them. And by this point now, Louis IX had gotten to the Mamluk side of the river, but the Mamluks were in a clearly dominant position, having executed Robert I's forces and having effectively spoiled the surprise. The Mamluks, with their superior numbers and organization, because they were able to bring in the rest of the Egyptian military, were able to defeat Louis IX. And as Louis IX was fleeing northward, he was actually captured along with his army by Baybars and the other Mamluks leading the charge against him. And you can see on the lower left-hand side, this is King Louis IX in Egyptian captivity. He was held prisoner by the Egyptians until he could ransom himself out. And the amount that he paid to ransom himself out was half of France's annual GDP. That should show you how difficult it was and how embarrassing it was as a European king to have been taken prisoner by a Muslim state. He was the first European royal figure to have been taken prisoner. We've talked about Guy of Lusignan, for example. The king of Jerusalem had been taken prisoner by Saladin, but this was a European king. And the failure of the Seventh Crusade was deeply saddening to many of the pious in Europe, specifically because, unlike the Fifth Crusade or the Sixth Crusade, these were not crusade. This was a crusade taken by somebody who was a genuine believer, and he failed so badly despite that auspicious start. Now, one of the interesting things about the Seventh Crusade that we didn't really discuss, because we were looking at it for a second from the European side, is that the Mamluks had been brought into Egypt by As-Salih Ayyub, but As-Salih Ayyub was not commanding the defense of Mansoura, nor was he involved in the Seventh Crusade. And the reason for that was quite simple. He wasn't alive. What ended up happening is that he died in 1249. And at that point, he was going to be succeeded by Al-Mu'azzam Turan Shah. You can see him in the upper left-hand side here. Turan Shah had previously been the Ayyubid governor of Damascus, and he had his own set of Mamluks. And the Mamluks that As-Salih had bought knew that if Turan Shah made his way to Egypt, they would lose their political power and they could possibly be killed. So they decided that what they would do is actually take the power for themselves and keep Turan Shah out of Egypt. One of these Mamluk, named Izzeddin Aybak, decided that he would be the one to lead this coalition of Mamluks, this council of Mamluks, you could call it. And he proposed to Shajar dur, the former wife of Salah Ayub, that the two of them should get married, and therefore her royal title would pass to him, and effectively the Mamluks would control the Egyptian state. Shajar ad-Dur agreed with the proposal, and the two of them effectively facilitated a Mamluk revolt and takeover in 1249 in what was effectively a bloodless coup. Al-Muazzam Turan Shah was killed when he tried to come to Cairo, and Izzeddin Aybak and Shajar ad-Dur tried to continue and perpetuate the dynasty. Now, this takeover was not recognized by the Abbasids in Baghdad. They considered Izzeddin Aybak illegitimate and a murderer of his erstwhile owner, right? Because since Salah Ayub died and he was owned by Salah Ayub, he should be, as typical property, transferred to another family member. And Turan Shah was that family member, so he killed his master. This created a massive legitimacy problem for the early Mamluk Sultanate that Izzeddin Aybak had to contend with. There's a question as to why did the Seventh Crusaders not retreat instead of being captured? They did retreat. They were just overrun. The Mamluks had horses, and the Crusaders didn't have sufficient horses to make their way all the way up the Nile before the Egyptians could capture them. As for why they failed so badly, they failed badly because they didn't anticipate the Egyptian defenses. There were many more Egyptians than there were Crusaders, and they weren't acting strategically at the Battle of Mansoura. If Robert, Count of Artois, had waited for Louis IX, and together they had done that surprise attack on Mansoura, there's a possibility that they could have won. But because Robert went first, he used up the element of surprise, and Louis IX was simply not able to capitalize. All right. So now the relation between Izzeddin Aybak and Shajar ad-Dur becomes rather interesting, because Izzeddin Aybak wants to bring all of the former Ayyubid territories under his rule, and there's an issue in bringing some of the territories near Damascus under his rule. And the way he decides that he wants to facilitate this is by marrying one of the princesses of Damascus. And he broaches this idea with Shajar ad-Dur. And as any woman in the audience probably can figure out right now, Shajar is not terribly excited by the prospect of being a wife in a multi-wife family, especially when it was her title that Izzeddin Aybak was marrying her for, right? She was the one who came to the marriage with property, with a sense of self, with royalty. And so she brings Izzeddin Aybak into the bathroom, and she stabs him repeatedly and throws him out the window. Now, following that, Izzeddin Aybak's son effectively becomes the Mamluk. There's a lot of squabbles with the Mamluk council as to whether or not that's acceptable. But when his son is old enough, he orders the murder of Shajar ad-Dur, and she is stripped naked, clubbed, the skin ripped from her body, and she's also thrown out a window. So that ends that relationship. But without her, the Mamluk council effectively becomes that governing institution of Egypt. And this process happens throughout the 1250s as the Mamluks begin to consolidate and coordinate their control. So while this is happening in Egypt, you would expect that the Crusader states would try and take advantage, right? You have this massive turnover in power, you have a legitimacy issue, you've got who are effectively royals throwing each other out of windows. This is not a good political situation going on here. And the Crusaders literally cannot capitalize on this. And they can't capitalize on it because the Crusader states are internally weakening. We've already talked about the War of the Lombards, but even the War of the Lombards left a lot of resentment between the different groups of people who were left. And we also see that a lot of crusading nobles could see the writing on the wall. The Crusader states weren't profitable. They were increasingly at the mercy of the Ayyubids or the Mongols. And so you had a number of these noble families leaving, creating an issue of fewer noble families who could bring forward the knights in order to protect the territory. The orders get smaller, and you have that sort of situation. You also have a number of property disputes. There was what's called the War of Saint Sabas, which was over a small plot of land in Acre that the Genoese and the Venetians both claimed to have owned. And because both of them were claiming to own, it was literally a building, because they were both claiming to own this building, it caused an entire civil war throughout the Kingdom of Jerusalem for about 14 years. So the Crusader states were in a state where they were increasingly failing to just be effectively governed. Add to this the three groups of knights, the Hospitaliers, the Templars, and the Teutonics, were trying to increasingly improve their own power. They would conquer territories and try to rule them with their own administration, meaning that similar to how the Iqta system had broken up the Great Seljuk Empire, this new system by the knights ended up breaking apart the control of the Crusader state of Jerusalem, meaning that there were many smaller entities that were far harder to bring together as a resistance against the increasing Muslim eye toward reconquering these territories. There's a question as to whether the popular Turkish drama whether the popular Turkish drama series Magnificent Century, Muhteşem Yüzyıl, is a historically accurate depiction of the Ottoman Empire. It's a very long but really great production quality. I would say that it's about as historically accurate as period pieces that are made today in the United States are. There's definitely stuff that's embellished, certain relationships that are created that are ahistorical. But if you watch that series, you can actually compare it to the episodes I've done. I think in terms of timeline, it matches up pretty well with episodes 24 through 26 of my Middle Eastern history series. Most of the major points in that series are quite close to history. So if you don't know anything, it's really great for a 101. If you know the history well, you'll see the small things that they got wrong, or the cases where 2 or 3 humans are sort of collapsed into one person because each of these people did something small. It's that sort of thing. So I would recommend watching it if you're interested in Turkish history. I don't know if there's an English dubbed version. I know that there are English subtitled versions. All right. And the Mongols then make their move on the Levant region. Remember, this is during that period where the Mamluks had just managed to organize themselves into that Mamluk council. And the council decides in 1259 that Izzeddin Aybak's son, who was like 16 years old and had his mother killed, his stepmother killed, was too young to really deal with the Mongol threat. They needed somebody who was a little older, a little wiser. And so they remove him from power and they put Kutuz into power as the new sultan. And Kutuz, as soon as he comes to power, he sees the Mongols with their vassals, the Armenians and the Antiochians, meeting together in Aleppo, and they besiege Aleppo in the latter part of 1259, the early months of 1260. And you can sort of see what that would have looked like with these massive cannons and trebuchets aimed at the city. One of the things that we have to understand is that this was the campaign of Hulagu Khan, which set out from Karakoram, from Mongolia, in the early 1250s. And Hulagu Khan had been given an army of 100,000 Mongols in order to conquer the Middle East. And that was added to when he arrived in Persia, where he was respected by many of the Persians, and they gave a number of soldiers under his command as the new monarch of Persia, as the new king of Persia. So the military that was showing up on the edge of Aleppo was an army probably around 100, 120,000 strong. To put this in perspective, that gigantic army of Saladin that we talked about, the one that overwhelmed the Crusaders to the point where they lost nearly every city except Tyre, that army was 30,000. The size and scale of the Mongol army cannot be overstated. They were seen as this incredible earth-shattering force. I think the right equivalent today to think about it is if aliens had landed, right? Just the size, the scale, the power of these people relative to anything that existed in the Levant, it was beyond description. Then after Aleppo fell, these three groups, the Mongols, of course, being the dominant one, also besieged Damascus in March of 1260. And there's a famous story. It's debated whether it's true or not. The Mongols at this stage were led by a general named Kitbolka, and Kitbolka himself was Christian. He was a Nestorian Christian, which is a Christian heresy, according to the Council of Ephesus in 431. But he was a Christian. And so you had Kitbolka with the Ketum I of Armenia and Bohemond V of Antioch, three Christian kings three Christian leaders entering the great mosque of Damascus, the fourth holiest site in Islam. Fourth holiest site in Sunni Islam. And they enter this mosque and they defile it, right? As part of their conquest and their proof that the Ayyubid state cannot withstand them, right? Or the nascent Mamluk state cannot withstand them. And they further conquer the city of Ajlun and even take the city of Gaza as a garrison. But at the end of 1260, the Mongols retreat a little bit further north to the northeast of Aleppo in the area called the Jazira, which is the area between the area between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in the northern part of Iraq. The reason they retreated back to the Jazira is that the Jazira has a lot of grass, and the Mongol army has so many horses. And in many cases, you have 3 or 4 horses per rider. So you have to feed these horses. And in the winter months, there simply just wasn't enough grass in the lower part of the Levant to sustain them. That said, Kitbolka was left around the area of Ajlun with about 20,000 with 20,000 Mongolian cavalry. And at the same time, in late 1260, Mongke, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, died, which meant that Hulagu Khan, who was his brother, had to go back to Karakoram in order to be part of the Kurultai, the council that would decide the next Mongol ruler. So he took with him the vast majority of his forces, about 80,000 of those Mongols, back with him to Mongolia in order to have that argument. And Kitbolka was left with 20,000 soldiers. Now, 20,000 was still a large number, but it was a large number now within the realm of understandability for the Mamluks. And what happens is something that we'll cover next time. For those of you who are asking where the history programs are mentioned, I'm going to post in the chat a link to the playlist, and then you can choose the episodes that you think correspond to which parts of the Middle Eastern history series you think apply, because I've mentioned it several different times, several different episodes. My thing is that I feel like all of this history sort of builds on itself, and so it's kind of hard to do it just as a single shot, which is why I did the series. So that's, sorry. So yeah, so here is the link to that playlist so everybody can see it. And of course, all 29 of our episodes that we've done so far are there. And yeah. Any additional questions, comments, concerns? All right, seems quiet on the Western Front. The next session is going to be same time next week. Yeah, so it'll be 5 out of 4 sessions. So the 5th session, to sort of finish this up, will be next week at Sunday at 2.
That's awesome. And then I was hoping, Richard, when you're all done, we'd stream the movie you keep referring to, but we'll work on that.
Richard, follow-up question on the
yes,
Mongols.
sorry, Saturday at 2. Thank you for clarifying, Becky. Yeah, Saturday at 2.
So, Richard, quick question on Mongols. And I don't know if you've gotten to this point, but why wasn't Mongols are not successful as they are in Asia Minor and later parts in China in this area? And then was there a good match to them, so to speak, from the Mamluk side as of warriors, 1-for-1, and why?
Well, I think that is a great question. That is literally the next slide. So when we come back next week, we'll have the answer to that. But the simplest answer is that if the Mongols had attacked Egypt with the full force that they had attacked Aleppo and Damascus, and they had just continued the campaign past Gaza, they would have taken Egypt. I don't know if they could have fed their horses in Egypt. I don't know if there's enough grass in Egypt to make that work, but they could have taken Egypt with that force. When Hulagu Khan pulls out of the Middle East with the vast majority of his soldiers, leaving Kibulka with 20,000, that, as I mentioned before, sort of tips the scales, and to the point where it won't be an easy situation by any means, but it suddenly enters the realm of the possible for the Mamluks to deal with this threat, as opposed to before, where it would have been functionally impossible. The Mongols simply come with too much in terms of numbers, in terms of artillery, in terms of siege weapons. People have this idea of the Mamluks of just riding in on horses, and that is certainly part of it. But the Mamluks brought with them all of the military skill and expertise of all the territories they had ever conquered. A perfect example is that the walls of Baghdad were brought down by a Chinese general, Guo Kan, who used catapults built in China, built in Iraq, but according to Chinese methodology, to take down those walls. And Guo Kan was in the service of the Mongols. He had been spared during the Chinese conquest and was given to Hulagu Khan because he knew that he would need to take down a number of siege fortresses. So that should give you an idea about the scale of the Mongol ingenuity of bringing all these different tactics to bear. And so it's not something that anybody in the Middle East had any exposure to. The Mongols are just playing on a different difficulty setting.
Right, and exactly what I've heard. But one interesting question, and it's always fascinates me when Mamluks, as you have stated, were the slaves, but when they were getting from Georgia and all other Caucasus region, Circassian, and all that stuff into Egypt, is there any contemporaries that state the fact of a slavery and being sold into Egypt? Was there anything like that? Like, we know the African, sub-Saharan, slavery is kind of well documented, but is there in the opposite way slavery? Wasn't any documentation or any kind of interest?
You mean the enslavement of Europeans?
Yes, right. Well, particularly because Circassians and Georgians.
Oh, we have lots of documentation. If we're talking about the people of the Caucasus, right? We're talking about Circassians, Georgians. I mean, those were the big two, but Armenians as well. We have lots of documentation about this. We have, because you have to remember, they're being bought and sold by some of the most erudite societies of their day. So we have lots of documentation about what prices were and how much they were going for and this, that, and the other. But we also have to notice the difference in scale. If we talk about transatlantic slavery, we're talking about between 10 and 20 million Africans over the course of 5 centuries. That's a massive number. And that is a massive number of port cities that we're dealing with. That's a massive number of different regimes that are involved, right? Going all the way down from the African kingdoms and tribal states along the coast that are trading these captured slaves with the Europeans, to the various European countries that are shipping them, to the various port cities that are receiving them. Usually the port city and the country of the boat that is transporting them are not the same country. Like the Portuguese would be dropping them off at Spanish ports, Dutch at British ports. You have all this sort of situation, all these kinds of situations with different slave codes that apply in different regions, how blacks are supposed to be treated in different countries. And there's a lot of documentation about it because we're talking about that vast number of people. When we're talking about the Circassian slaves and the Caucasian slaves, like Georgians and similar, we're talking about numbers in the thousands. There's probably something close to 40,000, 50,000 of these slaves that are taken over the course of 800 years, which is not a number to laugh at. This was incredibly injurious to Circassian and Georgian society, but we're not talking about the millions that we see in African slavery. So the documentation is from a few select cities, especially the city of Kaffa in Crimea, the city of Istanbul, which was a major market for them, the city of Tabriz, because one of the things we covered in the Middle Eastern History series in episode 20 was that the Safavids conquered areas of Georgia and Armenia and brought in them as slaves, and that slave group was called the Kurchi. So you have all of these different cases of Circassian slaves, Georgian slaves, Armenian slaves from the Caucasus, but it's smaller in number, and so the resources are fewer simply because the numbers are smaller. But we have very clear resources as to how they were bought and sold.
Right, that's why it's fascinating that, right now we have Circassian living all over the Middle East, and then we have them taking over as Mamluks. It's just fascinating to me. It's small numbers was able to prevail.
Well, we should be careful that we don't confuse the Circassians that became Mamluks, for example, in Egypt, and to a lesser extent in Iraq, and therefore gained power that way, and the Circassians that, for example, are empowered in Jordan or in Israel. Because those Circassian minorities, the latter ones in Israel and Jordan, are not a result of this slave trade. They are a result of the Circassian genocide in 1864 to 1867, when the Russian army forcibly expelled over 750,000 Circassians from their homeland in the Caucasus, and most of them found refuge in what was then the Ottoman Empire. So you have the largest number are in what is today Turkey, but there are some in Israel, Jordan, Iraq, some other states in the Middle East. So those are two different groups of Circassians. That said, because of Circassian military history, especially in Jordan, the Circassians have become part of the ruling elite in a way that the local population hasn't, because as a protected minority, they owe much more loyalty to the government than the local population, and so the rulers trust them more. It's actually very similar in Israel. The Circassians and the Jews had very good relations in the early Zionist period through to the modern state of Israel, because despite their low population of 4,000 within the state of Israel, they're disproportionately represented in the military and they're disproportionately represented in the civil service.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mhm.
Can I just make a quick announcement? We are actually looking for presenters for our history most ancient on any kind of topics, but we're particularly interested if people are interested to present something in Roman, Greek, Mesopotamian, Sumerian history, and Egyptian as well. I mean, not necessarily that people would know anything, but they can do research, and then we can, direct them also, and also help Richard with Middle Eastern, and partner with him also on a lot of the stuff that he does. And I think the Richard is going to do also the South Pacific and Pacific presentations, and likes to partner with people as well whenever
No.
possible.
It would be East Asia, not South Pacific.
East Asia, sorry, East Asia. So Bangladesh, Indonesia, Korea, China, Japan. Anybody has like extensive knowledge, uh, please do join our group and conduct presentations with us as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and just a note on that: if you would like to present with me, or as part of either the Middle Eastern history series or something else, I'm more than happy to do a joint presentation with somebody. So it doesn't have to be you speaking for an hour and a half. It can be you speaking for 15, 20 minutes, and I'll carry the majority of the presentation if you prefer that way, right? So it takes a lot of the burden off. But so I guess if that's it, and we have no further questions, we have a comment. I'm not sure how accurate this is. So, but it's the Circassians apparently facilitated the Nazis in World War II. I'm not familiar to what extent the Circassians facilitated the Nazis. I know that they were anti-Russian, and so similar to the Ukrainians and a number of other people that had been brutalized by the Russians. They were pro-Nazi in that regard, but it was the lesser of two evils sort of thing. I'm unaware of a large Circassian group that was pro-Nazi in the sense of we actually support the ideals of the Nazi government.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Richard. I mean, last time I remember on the Ukrainian one, we said that the Ukrainians that fought on the Russian side was much higher proportion to how many defected and fought on the Nazi side. So the Soviets sometimes use this propaganda, like they use propaganda on Chechens. There was a very small group of Chechens that fought and rebelled. They didn't even fight on the Nazi side, just rebelled against the Soviets, and they were all deported to Asia Minor, to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan because of the fact that Soviets just didn't like any kind of skirmishes that was happening during World War II. Same what happened to Tartars and even Koreans. Koreans were deported because they didn't want them to collaborate with Japanese, there was a major hate, and they were deported from Far East to Uzbekistan. It's just Stalin disproportionate way of propaganda, Soviet propaganda.
All right. I think
the program for next week's not on our calendar yet, but I'll email out the information, including the Zoom stuff. So if you are looking for that, it's not out there yet, but it will be. So I'll email that either later today or tomorrow.
And Patty brings up a good point. Don't forget to set your clocks forward this evening, or if you're using your iPhone, it will do it for you, but surprise, you might wake up a little earlier than you expected. Yeah, so tomorrow we enter daylight savings time, so things will be a little earlier tomorrow than you may otherwise expect. So
depending on what part of the world you're in, they don't have daylight savings time in every.
True. Sorry, I'm talking about the American.
No, it's okay for our American audience.
The Americans outside of, I guess, Arizona. I think Arizona doesn't have daylight savings time. I think Saskatchewan also in Canada made some sort of thing about.
Well, like London, they go on. I think their daylight savings time is not for a couple more weeks.
Exactly. It's yeah.
Anyway, but so that information will be emailed out and provided a little bit later. So
yeah,
look out for that. Okay. Any final thoughts from Zach or Richard?
No, just go ahead. Go ahead, Richard. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just just like I said, Richard does Thursday presentation on Middle Eastern culture with Roman history presentation. So that would be on Saturdays, and then Richard and Aaron in combination European presentation. It's all posted, I believe, with Robert. So do look out for those, and appreciate you continued participation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. And again, if you like what you heard, please spare a little bit to help us maintain the Zoom and everything else that and the meetup costs and all these kinds of things. All right.
Awesome. Bravo. Well, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe,
Thank
and
you,
we'll see you
Richard.
next time.
Thank you, Richard. Bye.
All right. See you.
Thanks
Bye.
everyone. Take care.